Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Spitz-Cohan, Executive Director of Film Pittsburgh. I'm excited today to talk to the director of On Broadway, Oren Jacoby. It's so nice to meet you. Am I saying your last name correctly?
Yes, that's great. Hi, Catherine. It's great to meet
Uh,
you too. And
yeah,
hi, Pittsburgh. So glad to be speaking to you.
that's great. Um, I have had familiarity with some of your previous films, including Constantine Sword and Sister Rose's Passion, which was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Short Documentary, I believe. And I'm excited to show this new work, although maybe it's not so new anymore. I know we were going to show it previously, but then because of the pandemic, it didn't make it into any of our lineups, especially when those lineups were canceled. But
Well, sadly, we finished the film a while ago and it hasn't had a wide release yet. But sadly, because of COVID, nothing has changed because the Broadway season got shut down in mid-season last year. And we filmed for this documentary the last full season of Broadway. And in a quite poignant way, it was the most successful season that the Broadway theater's ever had. More people saw Broadway shows. It was the most diverse audience that Broadway's ever had. The Broadway producers and the city of New York made more money from people coming to see Broadway shows than they ever had in the 100+ years of Broadway. So it was a highlight of this history that we tell in the film. And since then, it's been completely shut down.
which is heartbreaking, as is so much of what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Oren, how did the film come to be? I was just blown away by the sheer number of famous people that you had in the film. And I'd love to know, you're a theater guy, but how did this film come to be?
Well, I do have a theater background, and I'm not sure if people in this audience will remember if anybody saw the great Louis Malle movie Dinner with Andre. They
Of
talked
course.
about the great Polish theater director Jerzy Grotowski, who Andre had worked with in Poland. And I was very lucky when I was a young theater director. I met Grotowski in New York, and I was this young ambitious director right out of the Yale Drama School. And I went to him and I said, look, how do you, direct your career? How do you figure out what to do and what not to do? And where are you going to get your opportunities? And what's the best way to get going? And he said, people in life, just like people in the theater, just like people in life, think that they're making choices, that they're making decisions as they guide their life. What they're really doing is they're giving into temptations. And as you go through life, you'll find out that you're succumbing to this temptation or that temptation. And the most successful careers are the careers where you're succumbing to the temptation, which is in the long run going to take you to the best possible place. And so I think about my film career as a documentary filmmaker is film after film, I succumb to a temptation. Someone comes to me with an idea, or I read an article in a newspaper, or something gets me excited and I pursue it as a film idea. In this case, I was extraordinarily lucky, as I always am. I joke that documentary filmmakers are like, for another theater reference, are like Blanche in Streetcar Named Desire. We always depend on the kindness of strangers. So in this case, I met a woman at a New Year's Day party in Manhattan a number of years ago. I was introduced to the extraordinary Pat Schoenfeld, who at the time was 89 years old, and was the widow of Jerry Schoenfeld, who was a powerhouse on Broadway for many years, ran the Schubert organization, which we talk about in the film, and Jerry's in the film. And Pat said to me, my husband wrote a memoir before he died, which I published posthumously, and it tells a wonderful story about Broadway that people don't know. And so I think it would make a great documentary. Let's make a movie about my husband, Jerry. And I said, well, let me see the book and let's talk about it. And it sounds really interesting. And I read the book, and there was an extraordinary story in the book. But I explained to Pat, Jerry's no longer with us. This book is all from his point of view, of his take on things and how he experienced them. And sadly, he's not here to tell us those stories, and no one else can tell those exact stories for him. But the overarching narrative that he tells in the book is really an amazing story. And it's really about how Broadway almost went out of business in the 1970s when the Schubert organization was taken over by these two young lawyers, Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs. They were facing a theater industry that was in collapse. There was even talk the DA in New York wanted to tear down the Broadway theaters and turn them into parking lots so that they could have office parking for people coming in from the suburbs to park their cars. Um, and the miraculous story that we tell in the film is how this went from a bankrupt business to being an unbelievable, not just economic success, but popular success. That Broadway went from being something that people didn't care about and didn't really want to go to see the plays. I think in the 1972, when our film starts, there were maybe 4 or 5 plays running in the 40 Broadway theaters because people didn't want to come to the city to see plays, and they were afraid to go out at night, and the plays weren't very good. So it was an artistic and a business comeback that's unprecedented, I think, in any show business story that we were able to tell.
Truly amazing. How did you get all of that, all of those incredible stars to participate in the filmmaking?
Again, it goes back to the wonderful Pat Schoenfeld, who had maintained relationships with a number of these wonderful actors over the years, and the producers who had worked with her husband, who she had socially interacted with, and they liked her and were happy to come out and do a film. And, there were a few, things that I was able to pull in that people I knew. I was very fortunate to have done a very in-depth interview with the playwright August Wilson before he died, because I'd been a drama
Pittsburgh's
student.
Pittsburgh's
Pittsburgh's own
beloved. Hmm.
beloved August Wilson. And I'd gotten to know August quite well when he was doing his first plays at the Yale Rep, which is where I was a drama student. And I got to sit in on the first rehearsals of a number of the
Oh,
plays,
wow.
which we actually show some footage from back in the early days of his productions at Yale. And I did the interview with him, about 10 or 15 years after we'd met. But it was a long, in-depth, quite frank assessment by August of his work and what he thought his place was in American playwriting. And so we were very fortunate to have that already in
Hmm.
the can before we started this film.
Yeah,
Um,
fantastic. So, um, do you think that I bring this up because I mean nobody knows what's going to happen, but do you think there will be a Broadway revival? Do you think it will be able to come back?
I
You
think
just
it
said,
has to. I mean, first of all, the New York economy is so dependent on Broadway that they really have to, work together to figure out whatever the technology or whatever the medical provisions need to be that will allow people to come back and see live theater. I mean, they're already starting to do this in England. I mean, it's with middling success. I mean, they haven't totally figured it out, but they are bringing people back in to see plays, and they're spacing it out, and they're making fewer people in the audience, and so it's not quite commercially viable yet. But I think, they're going to have to adjust. But once there's a vaccine, and once we get through, once we have leadership in place, which is acting rationally, and we can sort of get things under control, I think that things will begin to come back to normal.
mhm. It's amazing to think that Broadway, I mean, I'm so grateful to you for telling this story because I didn't know it. And I have been a consumer of Broadway for many, many years. And I think it's fascinating for people to know that it almost wasn't to be. And so now, when we think about the fact that it will be shuttered for over a year at a minimum, I think what
Yeah.
are they saying now that they might reopen next summer, 2021 of summer?
Well, the first show was supposed to be the first big show that they were going to rescheduled was the Music Man revival with Hugh Jackman and Sutton Foster, which was supposed to first open this fall. They then postponed it to because of COVID. They postponed it to next spring, to next May. It's now been postponed till December of next year, so
Mhm,
December 2021. So I
mhm,
think that's when they're realistically hoping that they can open the theaters again, not till holiday time, more than a year from now.
mhm,
And if it happens sooner than that, that would be great. But I think that's probably realistic. Again, in terms of getting a vaccine, getting the safeguards in place that we need, and getting let's see how this winter goes. I mean,
mhm,
people have to start acting responsibly and looking out for each other and not
mhm.
spreading the virus. I mean, the story of New York is an incredible comeback story itself, of New
Yeah.
York under COVID, where New
Right.
York was the worst, hardest hit because all of the
Mm.
people coming into New York from Europe who first
Right.
spread the disease before anybody, before the government was taking it seriously and people were coming in. And
Right.
it was the worst death rate. I mean, 1,000 people a day were dying around me in New York
Yeah.
City. In an area that's 10 square miles or something ridiculous. And now, that's kind of spread is happening all over the country, but New York has got the lowest spread and has really stopped it just by people socially distancing and wearing masks. And
Mhm.
so I think, New York shows that you can get it under control. We'll get the whole thing under control, and then Broadway will have a chance to come back. And I think,
Mhm.
be strong again.
Yeah. Fingers
One
crossed.
of
I
the
hope so.
interesting things that we tell in the film, I mean, there were three stories that surprised me. I sort of had the basic arc from Jerry's book that it almost went out of business and it came back and everything was good. We didn't expect that the season we were filming would be the best season, most
Right.
successful season ever, but it turned out that way. The other things that I wasn't expecting was that I thought that the most commercial, successful shows over the period we would be covering, which is the last 50 years, I, as a kind of theater snob, thought, oh, well, the things that were successful were the sort of easy choices, the most commercial, obvious things that people would pick to be a success. But if you look at the biggest shows that made the biggest difference, that brought the most money to Broadway, they were all amazing gambles. They were all done by composers and directors and playwrights and producers who were willing to take huge gambles and try something that had never been done, whether it was a chorus line or Cats or uh, um, uh, The Lion King or Hamilton. Those were all shows that kind of broke the rules, and then they all broke box office records. So the one thing it showed is that Broadway, you know, represents that part of American spirit of being willing to take a chance, be willing to gamble on something,
Mhm.
and go with the unexpected.
Yeah.
The other thing that I didn't expect to discover was because people criticize Broadway as being too expensive, and people have criticized Broadway over the years as catering more and more to foreigners who don't speak English, and that it's for people who come in from the suburbs, and that it's sort of elitist because it's so expensive. What we discovered is that the biggest change in Broadway, in terms of the content on Broadway over the period we were covering, was how much more it began to reflect the diversity of America, both in terms of the subject matter and in terms of the artists who were making the shows. It became much more diverse in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender and gender affiliation, and all of those things have really, just Broadway has reflected what America is, which is kind of a remarkable thing about it.
I think some people would say it's about time. So it's great that that's your your takeaway, and there's always more work to do. And
Yeah, I
speaking
mean,
of which,
we have
yeah,
a number
go
of
ahead.
artists. Excuse me. We have a number of artists in the film who say that look, just because there has been this trend and it's gotten better and better, and that you can't go to a Broadway show now without seeing people of color in the cast, and that you have gender diversity and sexual preference diversity throughout the content and the artists who are behind the Broadway shows. There still is a long way to go, and Broadway has to do more, and we all have to do more to make
Right. Just
our arts reflect what our country is and what
right.
the majority of people are in our country.
So tell our audience, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a new. Well, I did a documentary we just finished recently that's on the New Yorker website. That's the story of Broadway since COVID. We do a short
Oh,
film which brings us up to the present with how Broadway is rallying around the people in the Broadway community who are trying to help each other. The Actors Fund, which is the big charity which works for people in throughout the entertainment business all over the country, New York, Hollywood. They've given out, I think, maybe $20 million already in emergency funds to help people who've been hit by not being out of work since this hit in March, in middle of March.
that's fantastic.
So that's up on the New Yorker website for people who want to see it. It's called "Give My Regards to Broadway," and I'm working now on a climate change documentary,
Oh, fantastic.
which is about the sort of the cover up by the fossil fuel industry, similar to the cover up by the tobacco industry, where the the Exxon Corporation, the mobile Exxon Corporation, knew in the early 1970s all about climate change. They had the best climate scientists in the world and were tracking where the world was headed. And they knew down to the decimal point of the percentage of CO2 in the air, and they knew down to the decimal point of the temperature where we were going to be at in 2020. They knew this back in the late 1970s. Then they did a cover-up, and they tried to pretend that the climate science was fake, and they spent millions of dollars trying to convince people all over the world that there was dispute about climate science when there was none among real scientists. The only people who disputed climate science were the ones who'd been paid by Exxon to do so, just like the only ones disputing the impact of smoking on people's health were the scientists who were paid by the tobacco industry to do so. And ironically,
go ahead.
Ironically, the people, one of the groups most responsible for bringing this to light are the descendants of John D. Rockefeller, a number of cousins in the Rockefeller family. John D. Rockefeller, who founded Standard Oil, his descendants, through their foundations, have paid for studies that have revealed what Exxon knew and are now supporting some of the lawsuits that are going into effect around the country, trying to bring Exxon to account for hurting so many people in different communities through the effects of climate change.
Wow.
We see whether it's the floods in by hurricanes or the wildfires in California and Oregon.
Oren, when do you expect the film to be finished?
We're in very, very early stages. We're just doing our research. We still have to raise money. We're just trying to get things going.
Gotcha.
But it's an important topic.
Right. Well, it's been wonderful to speak with you today. Thank you for what you do and for exposing and sharing the stories that you do. We're so grateful, and I just it's a pleasure to meet you face to face.
You too, and thank you for supporting the work of my work and the work of other documentary filmmakers. And I just hope everyone in the audience enjoys seeing. It was an honor for me and a real, incredibly lucky that I was able to work with artists like Helen Mirren and Christine Baranski and Hugh Jackman and James Corden and Alec Baldwin and Ian McKellen, and that they came out and told their stories in this film. And I hope everybody enjoys them in the documentary. It's good speaking with you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a great festival.
Thank you. To our Film Pittsburgh audience, thank you for tuning in today, and we will see you next time.